see my screen? Okay, great. So hello everyone, and thanks for tuning in for my talk. My name is Taïssa Danilovich, as Joya said, and I'll be talking about the circumstellar structure and dust formation around AGB and red supergiant stars. So I will warn you now that there'll be a bit more of an emphasis on AGB stars, since this is more my area of expertise. But first, I would like to talk a little bit about why people from other fields care about AGB and red supergiant stars. So what do they want from us to be able to understand other aspects of astronomy? So as we know, these evolved stars are responsible for depositing enriched gas and dust into the ISM. So the products of nucleosynthesis, are dredged up, ejected. Some of them go on to form dust, and then eventually they become part of the interstellar medium. So this enrichment of the ISM is interesting for people in other fields, since this drives the chemical evolution of galaxies. And then, of course, this ejected matter can also go on to form the building blocks of future stars and planets. So to fully understand our stars in this context, so to be able to help other people trying to understand these other aspects, what we need to understand is mass loss rates. So this is the quantity of the material ejected. So of course, this is important if we're injecting enriched material and we want to know how rapidly the general ISM is enriched. We need to know how much each particular star is contributing. We also need to understand the composition of the dust that's being ejected. So, what's it made of? Is it all oxygen rich? How much is carbon rich, etc.? Again, linking to this chemical evolution. And related to both of these points, we also need to understand how these change over time. So does the mass loss rate change over time? Does the composition of the dust change over time? If we're going from an oxygen-rich star to a carbon-rich star, how, when, etc., does this happen? These are just some ideas to keep in mind as I discuss circumstellar structure and dust formation. So starting with circumstellar structure, at one point we had this idea that the environments around these stars were spherically symmetric. We now have a lot of evidence that they don't. ALMA has shone a light on this to a great extent, but before talking about ALMA, I just want to talk about some earlier results. So we've known about detached shells around carbon stars for some time. This observation here is actually from a 2000 paper, and this was observed with the PDBI at IRAM, now NOEMA. You can see this particular detached shell is quite large, which is why it was able to be observed at this time. We can also look at formation in the largest, structure in the largest circumstellar environment. So for example, by imaging dust. So here I've shown a couple of images from PAX and 70 micron. So this is from a paper with a large survey of these stars. I've just chosen a couple that have a nice bow shock. So including Betelgeuse over here. This bow shock is the interaction of the circumstellar material with the ISM. So also understanding how this happens, what's going on there is relevant. And then a more recent result, here L2 Puppis, observed with sphere and Zimpole. And from this observation and the related analysis, we could already tell that there is a circumstellar disk around this star. Now, these are different wavelengths that I've just explained, because now I will be talking a lot more about ALMA, which has shown us a lot more different morphologies. So we've gone from this quite large and somewhat hollow, yes, you could say, detached shell around this carbon star to this very iconic image from ALMA, where we have a detached shell around a carbon star, which was expected, but inside that, a spiral, which at the time was quite unexpected. And this spiral is some sort of evidence of a binary companion that had not previously been detected. So other contributions to circumstellar structure from binary companions can be seen around Mira. So Mira is an AGB star with a white dwarf companion. And in this image from ALMA, you can see this cavity here, which is probably caused by the white dwarf companion. there's a cavity in the CO emission. And then on the left of this slide, I've got a lot of different images from the Atomian Alma Large survey. And this has looked at several AGB and red supergiant stars, though in this image, I could only fit the AGB stars, and a lot of different morphologies in the circumstellar environment have been found. So this image is CO observations and red, blue, and white images superimposed for redshifted, blue shifted, and the central velocity. So you can see some spirals along the bottom. You can see some more unusual structures like this hourglass shape for our hydra. Pygru, though it's less clear here, is also some sort of hourglass with a torus. A little bit more on that shortly. And I also want to draw your attention to our Aquila, which has this sort of rosebud pattern, which it's maybe not immediately obvious what this is. However, in trying to understand all of these structures, because of course, we do need to understand these structures if we do want to fully understand what's happening around these stars, how they're losing mass and so forth. There have been hydrodynamic models. So trying to understand the cause of the circumstellar structure. And then in particular, focusing on binary companions as a likely cause. This image here, you can see looks very similar to the image of Araquile on the previous slide. This is hydrodynamic model output, so it's actually just the density around star and a companion from Almela. And this was not modeled in a way that was particularly trying to exactly reproduce Araquile, but you can see already that there are some similarities there. And this is probably the right track for expanding those shapes. So in terms of like why we get different structures, excuse me, I've mentioned binary companions, but the mass loss rate seems to also play a role. So in the first paper about the Atomian results, we found that what was broadly in agreement with the observations is that, and earlier observations as well, for a low mass loss rate with a close companion, we're more likely to find a disk, so a disk-like structure close to the star that's often quite difficult to resolve, quite small. And then for higher mass loss rates is when we see these spirals. And those stars on the previous slide, other stars like our Sculptura, CW Leo that we now have spirals, do have quite high mass loss rates. And then we can also explain these more unusual bipolar structures with the presence of companions. So there's been quite a lot of studies of Haiwan by Doan and Herman, which I encourage you to have a look at if you're interested in this. But this kind of begets the question, like if all of these stars have these unusual circumstellar structures, do they all have companions? Well, it seems unlikely they all have a stellar companion, but maybe they all have some sort of planetary companion, or maybe there's some other cause as well. So I've talked a lot now about the physical structure in the circumstellar environment. I also want to talk a little bit about the chemical structure. So we can also deduce something from other molecules that we see, not just CO, which all of the previous images I showed were all of CO, but some other interesting results have been found. So for example, SiO and SiC2 are found to have lower abundances for higher mass loss rates. This is unexpected. We would expect at a higher mass loss rate, it's a denser environment, more collisions, more chemical reactions can happen. So we'd expect to see more different molecules, but having the opposite result is a bit unexpected. On the other hand, having, for example, SiS and H2S more readily detected and more readily present at higher mass loss rates does fit with this higher density, more molecules forming, or perhaps higher mass loss rates, more extreme environments, giving more potential for shock chemistry, for example, and other things like this. We've also seen that sulfur monoxide and sulfur dioxide appear in different regions of the wind, depending on the wind density. And this is thought to be linked to chemical reactions which are more prevalent in different regions depending on what other molecules are doing. So for example, water. And in CW Leo, the studied carbon star, it's been found that the spatial location of some of these long carbon chain molecules, which we expect to form sequentially, so the larger ones should be seen a bit further out because they're formed from the shorter ones. So we expect this sort of progression, but actually mostly they're found in approximately the same location. And this is thought to be because of a shell-like structure in that circumstellar envelope. So this is a case of the circumstellar structure driving the chemistry. So from what I've just said, there's a lot that we can't explain. The inverse correlation with wind density for SAO and SiC2 might be linked somehow to dust formation, since silicon, of course, is thought to participate in the dust formation process. So if there is less silicon available, perhaps then we form less SiO and less SiC2. So we've seen, I've just explained, with the hydrocarbon molecules, the circumstellar structure can affect the circumstellar chemistry. Do we see this perhaps for other molecules? This is something that still needs to be investigated in more detail. And as well as looking at the circumstellar structure in CO emission, if we look at other molecular lines, I mean, do these always trace the same structures, or do they obscure something, perhaps? So this can change our perceptions of the circumstellar structure. But it's important to remember that it's not necessarily just physical. There can also be some chemical structure in there as well. And now, since I've talked about dust formation, let's move on to the importance of dust. So dust-driven winds, particularly around AGB stars, are of course very important. They're the main drivers of mass loss. And I quite like this cartoon describing the dust-driven wind. And it is the dust primarily that is deposited into the ISM. The gas that by the time it reaches the ISM is mostly dissociated, so it's less likely to be molecular and more just atomic, though of course enriched perhaps by the products of nuclear synthesis nevertheless. The dust can also be covered in ices. For more on this, I direct you to Timothy's talk on Thursday. But although we may have ablation and so forth and sputtering, destroying some of the dust grains, we do know that the dust makes it to the ISM. So understanding the composition of this dust is important. And of course, we know that there are different types of dust around the oxygen-rich stars and the carbon-rich stars. And then we have the S-type stars in the middle. So if we assume this evolutionary progression from oxygen-rich to S-type to carbon-rich, when does the dust change from being more oxygen-rich to more carbon-rich? So a lot of the S-type dust that has been studied, which is a little bit less extensively perhaps, a lot of it still has N-like dust features. So when does it become more carbon-rich in the infrared spectrum? When we expect that to happen in the evolutionary progress? So when it comes to investigating dust, we can look at the infrared spectra, as I just mentioned. So that includes things like, for example, silicate features that we see for the N-type stars. We can also use spatially resolved high-resolution infrared imaging to probe the dust formation regions and this sort of thing. And then we can also look at dust precursor molecules. So this is molecular species that we think may go on to form dust. If we can detect them in the circumstellar environment, then that tells us something about where dust is or isn't, because the dust cannot form if that amount of atom or whatever is visible in the gas phase, but once it disappears from the gas phase, perhaps that is...
You have 2 minutes left.
Thank you. Perhaps that is where the dust is forming. And then, of course, there's pre-solid grains, which we discussed yesterday. So just to quickly talk a little bit about the formation of dust, we've got sort of two possible approaches, the top down and the bottom up. So the bottom up is starting with some sort of monomer, so a small molecule like TiO or ALO or Al2O3, and trying to build a dust grain by adding more of those on. A lot of the studies of these so far have been homomolecular growth, but heteromolecular growth is also possible, but so far a little bit difficult, computationally speaking, to investigate. So that's also something to look for in the future. In terms of possible seed particles, I direct you to Belanger, 2019, and I know David Lebrecht is working on a paper that's coming soon, also on this topic. So yeah, we need to understand a lot of these questions about dust formation to really understand what is happening in the wind. And I will now leave you with this slide with some of the unsolved questions and outstanding problems. So it covers what I've been talking about companions, about differences in chemistry, dust production, nucleation, and the evolution of the circumstellar environment. Thank you.